Hi, today I would like to share with you one of the greatest games played by Mikhail Tal against the British women champion Cathy Forbes. Tal is playing white and he starts the game with pawn to e4. And by the way, let me say that as usual, we'll try not just to enjoy the beauty of this fascinating game, but also to learn a couple useful tricks applied by Mikhail Tal so that you too can use the same techniques in your own games. Cathy Forbes is playing black. So far it is the Sicilian defense, pretty common opening moves. And at this point, black played g6, going into the dragon variation of Sicilian defense. Definitely a brave choice against Mikhail Tal, who is the great attacking player, while the dragon variation is considered to be quite risky because it gives white a lot of opportunities for attacking on the kingside. So far these are theoretical moves, so I do not go deep into analyzing them. At this point, black played knight to d7. Now let me take a moment to address this move. Knight goes to d7. This is a theoretical move, and yet it looks a little bit strange. Black is moving his knight backward and closing the bishop on the c8. Oftentimes, if I ask a student, why did you play such a strange looking move? And people reply to me that, well, it's a theoretical move, or I've seen that grandmaster, that world champion played the move. But the truth is, if you do not understand very clearly the reason of the move, or rather, if the move seems to be a little bit strange to you, then never play it, even if someone played it before. Maybe it worked out for some world champion who had some deep ideas behind it, but it does not necessarily mean that it will work out for you. So play the moves that you fully understand and that look natural to you. Alright, let's move on. Tal played h4, starting the attack on the kingside with an intent to play h5 and then open up the h-file for his rook. Black replied knight to b6, attacking white's bishop, which was the black's intention of that maneuver of the knight. White retreated, black played knight to a5, continuing to chase the bishop. And white played h5, continuing his plan of attacking and opening up the files on the kingside. Black played knight to c4, this time attacking the queen. So obviously white has to do something about this, and Tal played queen to e2. Now black took the bishop on e3, and just to mention that knight takes b2 is impossible, even though it would win a pawn for a moment, but the knight has no way back, and therefore after rook b1, this knight will be captured. There is no way to escape. So that's not a good way for black, and that's why in the actual game black played knight takes e3. White recaptured, and black captured another bishop of white. This is somewhat an achievement of black, because usually a bishop is a little bit stronger than a knight. And yet black wasted a lot of time jumping with his knights around in order to trade off the white's bishops. And during this time, white already managed to develop some sort of attack on the kingside. The game continued, white castled, black played pawn to e6. And here Tal noticed that if he would just straight away trade off the pawns on g6, then even though it could open the line for him, for his rook, but there is no continuation of his attack. The black's bishop on g7 is doing a great job covering all the squares around black's king. And therefore it was clear for Tal that he needs to bring additional resources to open up the position around the black king. And therefore, instead of trading the pawns right away, he pushed another pawn forward, pawn to f4. He wants to push this pawn forward and continuing to eliminate all the defenders around the black's king, and in particular, he wants to trade off those pawns that cover black's king. Black played queen to b6, and white continued his plan, pawn to f5. Notice how methodically Tal keeps opening up the position around black's king. Black traded off the pawns, and since the g-file is now open, and her king, I should say, is now vulnerable, she moved the king to h8. By the way, the black player Cathy Forbes was the British woman 3 times champion, so she's a quite strong chess player, so it's interesting to see how Tal managed to break through her defense. Here Tal played rook to f1. It was clear for Tal that the h-file is now closed. since the white has the pawn on h file and there is no way to trade it off, there was no work for the white's rook from the h file, and therefore he repositions the rook to an f file. And now the rook not only potentially supports that f pawn in case the line is opened, but also it supports the pawn in moving forward, which will attack the black's bishop, and the bishop has no square to escape. And that is why black decided to simply exchange that bishop, and she took bishop takes d4. That is definitely the easiest solution to save that bishop, and yet I would say that you should always be really careful with trading off your fianchettoed bishop, because right after you do that, let's have a look at what happens next. You have all these bunch of squares that were previously controlled by the bishop, and now they all become vulnerable and they become a weakness that your opponent can take advantage of. So I would say never exchange the fianchettoed bishop off your castling without a certain very significant reason. And in that position there was no big reason for that. There were other ways for black. If she was worrying about this pawn moving forward, capturing the bishop, she could simply provide an escape square for the bishop. Just move the rook away, let's say to the g-file, to strengthen the defense and also provide this escape square for the bishop. And black would be quite alright. In the actual game, black did not play rook to g8 though. Instead, she played bishop takes d4. And after this exchange, black continued with pawn to e5. And definitely black was hoping for the white's rook to come back, something like rook to d3, and then the queens would be traded off, and this would lead to an about equal endgame. But Mikhail Tal really enjoyed shocking his opponents with unexpected sacrifices, and that's why we loved his game so much. And that's how, in this position, instead of saving his rook, he decided to sacrifice it, and he played queen to h6. What's the reason of giving up the whole rook? Let's see what happened next. After queen takes d4, white continued queen f6 check, king g8, and what should white do next? You may think about it for a moment. How would you continue white's attack here? It is not such an easy question actually, because the most straightforward ways do not really work. If white would play pawn to h6, aiming for queen g7 checkmate, black can cover the g-file by playing queen to g4. And now this square is under the control of the black's queen, and therefore there is no way for white to checkmate black. Instead of h6, white could try rook to f3, aiming to play rook g3, but then there are a couple of things black can do, and one of them is to start counterattacking with queen to g1, and then this queen can also capture that pawn. So it's also not really the way for white. And what he should do then? Tal noticed that in case of h6, black can bring the queen to g-file by playing queen g4, and that is how he came to an idea that he needs to deflect black's queen firstly, and that's how he played knight to d5. One another sacrifice, this time he sacrificed the knight. If you did not manage to find this move, do not worry, that's quite a complex combination, and if you manage to find it, then great, congratulations, you're playing as strong as Mikhail Tal. By the way, over the last months we've been working on a complete course about Mikhail Tal, where we deconstruct the way he managed to find such brilliant moves. And therefore, if you like to know how Tal managed to find these moves and calculate the consequences, you will be able to study that in our upcoming course, where we'll reveal the magic of Mikhail Tal. So stay tuned, and for now let's just continue with the current game. Besides deflecting the queen, so the knight is also aiming to checkmate black after knight e7. But firstly, let's see what would happen if black actually captures the knight. In that case, white continues with queen to g5. The only thing black can do is king h8, and here comes pawn to h6. And now we can see why it was so critical for white to make this check first, and only then push his pawn forward. Right now, white is threatening to play queen g7 checkmate, while the black's queen cannot go to g-file anymore, and the g2 square is under the control of the white's queen. That was the reason of white playing queen g5 check. And there is simply no defense for black. The only way is rook g8 to cover up the g7 square, but then queen f6 and the king is checkmated on the next move. Alright, let's go back to the position after white played knight to d5. Black player, as I said earlier, is an experienced player. She didn't capture the knight, instead she played rook to e8 to provide some free space for the king and at the same time to prevent white's knight from playing knight e7 checkmate. However, Tal has a good idea of what to do here. He still plays queen to g5, checking the black's king, and then what should black do? There are only two options, and king f8 would lose immediately. After the forcing lines, queen h6 check, the only way for black is king g8 and then knight f6 check, following with queen takes h7 checkmate on the next move. So this is not the way for black. Let's go back. In the actual game, instead of moving to f8, black played king h8. And now it may seem like it's not that easy for white to continue his attack, because black is just ready to play rook g8 anytime. So white played pawn to h6, creating that threat of queen to g7. So white is ready to either play queen g7 or queen f6 and continue his attack, and that is why black played e4 to include her queen into the defense. Tal continued pawn to f6 to bring one more pawn closer to opponent's king and more importantly to closing to shut down this diagonal for black's queen. Now white is still threatening to play queen g7 checkmate, his main threat, but it looks like black can cover it so easily by playing rook to g8. And what should white do next? Try to find the winning continuation for white here. I'll give you a couple seconds to think about it. Well, knowing that this is Tal playing, you would probably assume that there was a certain sacrifice, and your guess is absolutely correct. Tal played a brilliant move, very unexpected, queen to g7, sacrificing the queen, and the point being, after the rook captures the queen and pawn takes, king goes to g8 at the only move, and here the knight delivers checkmate, knight to e7. Very sudden, unusual checkmate with an only one piece into the attack with just a knight. And it's also amazing how the white pawn from g7 is taking part into this checkmating position, which is also quite a rare situation. Really spectacular game, very sudden ending, and I think it was a shocker for black to see that her defense was just devastated in such a brilliant way. I hope you enjoyed this game. It is quite an unknown game of Mikhail Tal, and yet it's so beautiful. If you wish to download this game in PGN format together with some additional comments, you can find the link in the description below the video, so everything that I've mentioned, the game and the complete course about Tal, you can find the link there. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit like for the video, and I'll talk to you in the next videos.